So Finance Minister Tito Mboweni is set to table the 2021 budget against the backdrop of an ailing economy and spiraling debt, now standing at about 4 trillion rand. Meanwhile, 7.2 million people are currently without jobs, with unemployment rising to about 32.5%. That's the highest on record. The COVID-19 pandemic hasn't made things easier on any of these scores. For more on what Mboweni ought to say in what's been touted as the toughest budget yet, let's bring in our panelists for our chat this morning. Dr. Sharon Smulders is the SAICA Project Director for Tax Advocacy. Dr. Peter Jacobs, a Research Director at the HSRC, and Eddie Rakabe is an economist at Empirican Consulting. To all three of our guests, thanks very much for your time, and it's great to have you on the program. Dr. Jacobs, let me perhaps begin with you as we try understand where on earth we should begin. Should perhaps the Finance Minister take a leaf out of President Cyril Ramaphosa's books by just choosing about 4 main issues he wants to tackle and use that to try and convince the rest of us that there is a plan to turn around this economy?
Yeah, good morning. Good morning to all the viewers. Indeed, is the standard mode of operations when it comes to the national budget is usually to take the cue from the State of the Nation address and from the 4 priorities. The health one, of course, is number 1, but number 2 is, I think, the most critical one, which is about boosting growth, employment, and jobs. And I think that is what will be a key focus. But it's very difficult for fiscal policy. Why? Because you've got to try and balance the ability of the economy to grow fast enough so that you can generate the necessary tax revenue. And at the same time, you have to be able to get your spending priorities right. So this is the trickiest problem confronting Minister Mboweni. How do you strike a balance between the demands of the fiscus and reduced fiscal resources as a result of the reduction in the growth? That, I think, is going to be the toughest difficulty for him to surmount.
Right. Dr. Smulders, we've heard about the hippopotamus mouth before. I find it to be quite an interesting analogy, this idea that debt is on the rise as revenue goes down, and the objective is to try to close the mouth of this hippopotamus. We heard from the Minerals Council of South Africa, though, that it appears mining has been able to give more tax than expected in 2020, at least in comparison to 2019. Is that enough, though, to avert a rise in taxes for this budget?
Well, I'm hoping so. We've done some estimations so far, and it seems that we will be overshooting our target for revenue collection, which is one of the most positive signs I think we've had in a long time. But I just want to reiterate, tax revenue has actually never been the problem. We've had the growth in tax revenue has been fantastic, actually, if you consider it. So the revenue side is not a problem. It's the actual expenditure side that we're concerned with. So I don't think there should be additional tax increases coming through. We know there will be about 5 billion that he mentioned for this fiscal year coming up. And over the next 4 years, it will be 40 billion. But there is enough revenue. In fact, our tax to GDP ratio is way higher than most of the other countries in the world. So we're already extracting a lot of tax out of a very small economy. Our economy cannot give more tax. So we're not hoping that, well, we're hoping that there will not be any tax increases other than those that you already alluded to. But the expenditure side is where the focus, I feel, should be.
Yeah, and the expenditure side does have a few, call it, landmines, Eddie. This idea that the public wage bill should be this untouchable aspect of our budget because of the possible retaliation from labor itself. In fact, as you and I speak, SAFTU is organizing a nationwide strike today. Does the finance minister dare enter that terrain, or does he even have a choice, frankly speaking?
Well, Ayanda, he has already entered that terrain. Of course, I mean, if you think about last year already, there was a wage freeze, and currently we undergoing this court case between labor and government about whether labor should be granted the inflation adjustment that was promised in 2019 as part of the wage bargaining agreements. Unfortunately, I think the minister will be really in a difficult position here, because on the one side, he really needs to find himself balancing this fiscal sustainability, but at the same time, we've got all these demands from labor, but also from the social services, or from the social services. So it is really a big challenging terrain which we've already entered, but unfortunately we don't have a choice. The minister really have to find a way to really, through a social contract of some kind between labor and government, to make sure that there's a meeting of the minds in as far as the salary is concerned. He said it is definitely taking quite a huge chunk of the budget. We're sitting at around 60 to 65% at this point in time. So really, any more adjustment to the salary bill would really be taking away money away from the crucial social services, especially for people who are vulnerable, who have lost their jobs currently. So it's really a balancing act that needs to be
It is indeed, yeah, especially because, Dr. Jacobs, the president had kind of set his own bar of getting a more inclusive economy. I mean, that term has been punted for years now. Interestingly, no, I remember that 500 billion rand stimulus package. There were hopes that it would, in some ways, stimulate household demand. Many more people would hopefully be able to go out and buy stuff, and that in turn would stimulate some kind of economic activity. Have we gotten that right, given how much time has elapsed since the announcement of this package?
Yeah, this I think is one of the areas that concentrated a lot of the attention and energy in the medium-term budget policy statement last year, and also the emergency budgets that the Minister of Finance presented previously. Obviously, I think in this budget, he's definitely going to return to that at three different levels. The first level is obviously to go and take stock of what has happened, how far they've been able to firstly get the funds, the 500 billion, and more importantly, the second element is the distribution of that 500 billion. Now, the 500 billion is roughly 10% of our GDP, but it is not in line and consistent with what we've seen in other parts of the world. In other parts of the world, the countries, the stimulus packages and responses have been far more ambitious. So why is this only at 10% given the socioeconomic demands on the fiscus that we are confronted with? So that's the first part, I think, that is very, very important, because really in that 500 billion, there is roughly just 10% of that is going, about 50 billion, that is really directly going to the kind of necessary socioeconomic support by the needy, the vast amount of needy as a result of the coronavirus pandemic and the resulting deepening of the recession. So that's a big challenge that he's confronted with. The third element is, I think there's going to have to be some kind of statement today about what is going to happen about funding or finding sufficient money to cover that 500 billion. There was a controversy last year about how he's going to fund that money, and that there will be a substantial amount of money coming as a so-called donation, tax-free or interest-free from the IMF. I think things have changed quite substantially since then, and he's got to answer and respond to this particular problem of the conditionalities attached to funding this 500 billion, and what would that entail in terms of new conditionalities imposed on South Africa's economic path going forward.
Interesting you mentioned funding. It does bring to mind the IMF, which I also think you mentioned now. I mean, Dr. Sharon, what the IMF had also said is worth us remembering when it comes to South Africa's management of its debt levels, which you believe is part of the actual issue we're facing in our country. The IMF raising red flags and saying we need to, A, look at reining in our wage bill. We've already touched on that, but also avoiding ill-targeted subsidies and transfers to inefficient SOEs. The latter of that becoming an increasingly emotive issue in our country because, I guess, of all the stakeholders involved. How, if at all, should the minister try, at least acknowledge the problems with our SOEs and attempt to fix it?
We have to fix it. We don't have a choice. We have to rationalize the SOEs. Those that are not profitable, we need to get rid of. The fiscus can't afford to keep these SOEs on board anymore. We just do not have the luxury to keep bailing out all the loss-making SOEs. We have to take a stance on this because, our budget now cannot handle any unproductive SOEs or loss-making SOEs unless there is potential to turn them around. And if there is, we need proper plans in place to ensure that they are properly managed financially and that they are delivering the services that are actually needed. The whole world has changed, services are changing, so we need to critically look at SOEs and say which ones are there still a need for, and we cannot afford to keep bailing the ones out that are not working.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine there's no debate about us needing to fix the SOE problem. Eddie, I mean, do we have solutions, though, about how that SOE problem is to be fixed? The SOE question, if I'm able to coin that phrase this morning.
Yeah, definitely. We don't really have shortage of solutions to deal with the SOEs. We've had the president appointing a council of advisors which are going to be dealing with these SOEs, and they produce a report which actually comes up with quite a number of recommendations about how to deal with this SOE. So, but really, the problem that we're dealing with, which is a South African problem, is the implementation of this recommendation. So we're sitting here today after so many years. This report has come out, but we still have not had any of those recommendations implemented. Even the Minister of Finance himself came into the public at some point and said, we are not going to be bailing out the SOEs. But even after having taken that hard stance about the SOEs, we still see the political machinations within, I suppose, the ruling party, where we still find that even after those hard stance taken about the financing of or bailing out of SOE, we see more money even going to this SOE. So really, it means that there are really big problems within the institutions which are running these SOEs, which we really need to be dealing with. Rather, it's not really the shortage of the solutions, but really it's the political will to really deal with the problems.
Yeah. Dr. Jacobs, Eddie touches on an issue that I was hoping to get to. We don't necessarily look to the finance minister's budget speech to weigh in on the political machinations, but those are unavoidable almost completely as we try to figure out how we could chart a way forward with our economy. But with that also being said, I wonder whether there is enough said to reach out to the people who are in the most vulnerable position if our economy doesn't get fixed. I mentioned the idea of this inclusive growth that we speak about, even in these panel discussions. How can the minister make today's budget more accessible to Gogo Dlamini, which is the term that the former public protector, Thuli Madonsela, used to use quite often? The ordinary South African who, in many respects, some of these terms are completely removed from their experience.
Yeah, well, this is what we have been spending quite a bit of time on, is to focus macroeconomic policy, as what we refer to in our own unit, on the problems of the poor. Inclusive economic growth is fine. It's a wonderful term. It's very, very attractive. But the devil is really in the details. Is how do you transform inclusive economic growth really to direct participation of people in economic decision-making and economic policies? And that is, I think, where the minister and as well as the government at large have really been failing. It has not been able to get the direct participation and buy-in of the population in its macroeconomic policy agenda. And this is going to be one of the most complicated difficulties. The ongoing labor strike that we're going to have in the as a result, a consequence of placing pressures on government is really going to be, I think, a signal of the responsiveness of the state to the social sectors, as what we call it, the extent to which it is really inclusive, not only in words but inclusive in deed.
Absolutely. Dr. Sharon, if the minister is listening to us this morning, what's that one more thing you would say to him?
Well, there's two things. The first thing is, I think we need to start enforcing accountability, and National Treasury has that power. In terms of Section 216 of the Constitution, it's clear National Treasury has to enforce fiscal accountability across all of the state organs. So they have to use their power. They have the power to fix the financial state of our SOEs, for instance, of our municipalities who are in a shocking state. So we really need to force the accountability, and it starts at home. I mean, even the National Treasury has now got, irregular expenditure, wasteful expenditure. That should not be happening. Number two is we need to work together. And I think that's important for me, is that the government cannot do this alone. We need to work with they need to work with the private sector. None of us can do this alone. It is collaboration. And we need to start using, the government has to hold hands with the private sector, and let's fix the country.
Absolutely. We can have this conversation until the minister takes to the podium, but we're going to have to wrap it at least for now. Really appreciate your insights and for your making time to talk to us. Dr. Peter Jacobs, Research Director in the Inclusive Economic Development Division in the HSRC. Dr. Sharon Smulders, Psycho Project Director for Tax Advocacy, and Eddie Rakabe, who is Empirican founder. To all three of our guests, thanks very much indeed for your time.